Good people, welcome to the latest episode of Jonathan Thinks. I am your host, Jonathan Collins, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar. I've got a few things on my mind, and maybe, just maybe, you've been thinking about them too. First thing on my mind is the developments with this Callais court ruling story. So if you've been following, what's happening in the news, and if you've been listening to the show, you know that weeks ago, there was the big Supreme Court ruling on the case that emerged from Louisiana, the Callais case. And there's been a lot of hoopla in the media about the Callais case, and it's the end of Black representation, and everybody's been just so down and just acting like this is the end of the world and there's no hope. And I'm not here to tell you that things are about to be great, but I've been telling you, it might not go the way that conservatives think that it's going to go. That the Callais ruling opened the door for the Republican Party to engage in a whole lot of new racism. And they're banking on the idea that the voters in these southern states are just as, if not more, racist than we think. And like I said a couple weeks ago, it might not be the case. They might not be as racist as you think. There might actually be hope for Black political representation and Black political power, despite what the Supreme Court decided. And I'm here today to talk about two important stories that are getting overlooked. One story is in Alabama, and the other story is in South Carolina. These are two states where, for different reasons, states have stepped in and blocked the redrawing of district maps. So let me rewind. What the Callais ruling allowed for was the redrawing of congressional districts within a state. So again, in most states, the state legislature, your state government representatives, they come together, and usually every 10 years after a new census, they draw the congressional lines that establish the congressional districts for your member of the House of Representatives, right? This Callais ruling from the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court ruling in the Callais case, I think is a more accurate way to say this, basically stipulated that you could not draw lines with race in mind, right? That the drawing of these lines needed to be race neutral. Now, this was big because it's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that bars discrimination based off of race. And a lot of people have been interpreting that decision as the Supreme Court, this has been the storyline, the Supreme Court strikes down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That's not exactly technically true. If you look at the majority opinion, they still do leave room for the idea that Section 2 matters, that racial discrimination can indeed impact political participation, and therefore any effort to enact racial discrimination is still a constitutional violation. What they did, though, was they changed the threshold, and they made the scope more narrow on what counts as discrimination. They basically said, look, we are not saying that racial discrimination doesn't violate the constitutional rights of Americans. What we're saying is that racial discrimination, it has to be overt. It has to be able to be proven. And that hasn't necessarily been the case up until now. Before the Callais ruling, we could look at just evidence of racial disparities, and that was sufficient to show that there was racial bias and racial discrimination, right? If there's statistical evidence that Black people are not getting access to something or being deprived something, even if there is no clear mechanism determining how they were being deprived, just the existence of the disparity was enough to trigger action to support and protect Black folks and protect minority groups. The Supreme Court is now saying, no. You need to find the smoking gun. What gets tricky is if you know how racism works, right? Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks about the idea of colorblind racism, right? David Sears talks about symbolic racism, racial resentment. these new forms of racism that are more subtle, less overt, and harder to detect as explicit Jim Crow style discrimination, right? What's interesting, finally going back to Alabama and South Carolina, especially Alabama, but also South Carolina a little bit, what happens is in South Carolina, the Republicans attempted to redraw the district lines to eliminate one of the black districts, but folks within the state of Alabama contested this, which triggered a review by a 3-judge panel, basically. And that 3-judge panel decided that the attempt to redraw the district lines, especially during a congressional election or during campaign season for a congressional seat, that this actually represents the more overt form of racism that is still protected by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. In South Carolina, the state legislature decided we are actually not going to move forward with redrawing the lines that would have essentially drawn out Jim Clyburn's district. And they used the excuse that it was too much federal interference. There were folks from the National Republican Party who are trying to have too much influence over the state. And the process should maintain itself as a state process. Okay, sure, whatever the argument. The fact is, it created controversy. It triggered this use of overt racism, and there was backlash as a result of it. And these are 2 states where we pretty much expected black representation to be weakened, and now suddenly it's not. And so I told you, the racism might not cook up the way that they thought it was going to cook up. And what's happening is, in the aftermath of this ruling, Southern Republicans are going straight to the racism, and they're being so explicit in how they are trying to draw out and weaken black political power that it's so obviously racist. And this obvious level of racism actually triggers the use of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So they're basically tripping over their own feet because of their racism. So again, does this mean that the fight is over? Not by a long shot. You look at Tennessee, where a 3-judge panel actually upheld the new congressional map. You look at Florida, where a judge actually allowed a contested Republican favored map to proceed. So, this is not to say that the attack is not working, but there's a glimmer of hope that this ruling has triggered Republicans to be too racist for their own good. And again, if the South Carolina and especially the Alabama case tell us anything, it's that this level of overt racism that is going into the redrawing of these lines might be too much racism for their own good. Speaking of a greater good, the next thing that's on my mind is a very related story, which is the out of bounds NAACP boycott. So the NAACP announced a boycott that they are pushing for across 8 southern states, including Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Texas. And essentially, they want black athletes, especially in football and basketball, that are the higher lucrative sports. They want black athletes participating in these sports to essentially boycott attending universities in these states in order to raise awareness of the racial gerrymandering issue. And I'm a little conflicted about this story. I'll start with the con side, right? And the con side is these are children, right? These are 18, 19-year-olds. Really, when they start to get recruited, you're talking about 15, 16, 17-year-olds. By the time they step on college campuses, they're still like young men and young women, 18, 19, 20. And that's a lot to place on the shoulders of young folks, and especially in a boycott movement that is very recent. There's precedent for kids, obviously, to be involved. You think about the school desegregation efforts in the U.S. that triggered the Brown v. Board ruling, right? This started with kids, with parents getting together with kids and deciding that these black families were going to send their kids to predominantly white schools and face all of the violence and acts of intimidation that came along with that. And again, you think about the famous Ruby Bridges photo, right? And this is a child, carrying on her shoulders the challenge of changing the spirit of a country. And we're kind of asking kids to do that again, but except Ruby Bridges and a lot of the children who were involved in the school desegregation efforts, these were years-long processes that led up to this. There were trainings, there's recruitment. Like this was This was not a spur of the moment thing. This was, like I said, years in the making of activism. What we want now is for these young Black athletes to pivot from focusing on the sport that they've been playing really their entire lives mostly, and are on the cusp of an opportunity to play at the collegiate level, which is one of their dreams, and now have that dream interact with this larger political cause. And trust me, nobody wants them to fight for this political cause more than me, but I am sympathetic to the idea of what this means for children. So that's the con. But the pro is there is proof of concept that this can work, right? In 2015, pressure from the University of Missouri college football team, Black players on the team in particular, led to the resignation of the president of the University of Missouri system, who essentially doubled down on some pretty racist ideas. 2020, you had Black college football players from the University of Mississippi that were at the forefront of pushing for Mississippi to get rid of the rebel flag, and it worked, right? So there's proof of concept that this activism, when led by college athletes, it works. With this in particular, there are two issues. One issue is that the boycott itself is an indirect challenge to the racial gerrymandering problem. So theoretically, it works like this. The Black college athletes decide that they are not going to attend these colleges and universities and play for these programs in states where this racial gerrymandering is happening and Black political power is being torn down. And that the economic hit of not having some of the most talented athletes play for these programs will cause the colleges, universities, and the boosters and the entire economic infrastructure of these major college programs in the South to then apply pressure to the state legislature to say, hey, state lawmakers, you cannot keep redrawing maps in ways that weaken Black political power because you're hurting our pockets. And at best, it's a strategy that won't pay off until there's another opportunity to redraw the lines, which, depending on the state, there are more opportunities. But usually we haven't seen the redrawing of lines until every 10 years after the census, although some states, there's the ability to redraw lines mid-decade. And that's why you're seeing some of these challenges now because of that ability to redraw mid-decade. But essentially, it would be the colleges and universities, because they're losing so much money, essentially applying pressure to the state to change the laws. And, one, that's not a direct way of addressing the legal challenge. And then two, all of the members of the state legislature are not impacted by college athletic programs. If you're a state legislature in a Memphis suburb, you're probably not that compelled by the pressure from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is in Eastern Tennessee. But you will be relying on just the sheer economic and, I guess, political force of the university system to change the behavior of the legislature. And it's a big leap. The other issue I have is, why aren't we talking about the white players? Why is this only a boycott effort that's supposed to be led by Black players? Because the best version of this is white players in solidarity with Black players around the idea of protecting Black representation. If you go to Jackson, Mississippi, they have a civil rights museum. And I remember I've gone there a couple of times. I taught a class that made a trip down there. And one of the things that stood out to me most at the museum was this special exhibit of the Freedom Riders who got on buses in Washington, D.C., and they rode through all the southern states to get to New Orleans. And they stopped at restaurants, they stopped at hotels, they got arrested because they were boycotting the lack of enforcement of a ruling from the Supreme Court that said that segregated busing was unconstitutional. But if you go to the exhibit in Jackson, Mississippi, and you see the mugshots of the protesters who participated in the freedom rides, it's not just Black folks. It's not just Black women and Black men, right? There are a lot of white folks who are also holding those jail numbers for their mugshots, right? But when it comes to this out of bounds protest, all I've been hearing about is the idea of Black players. And personally, I think that there should be more of a call to ensure that, no, where are the white players? Step up. We need you to be a part of this movement too. Going back to 2020, the summer protests after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered, right? Multiracial effort, multiracial protests. That's why it was effective. That's why we saw one of the most radical transformation of racial politics in modern history happen in that summer, because everybody was a part of this. Everybody was locked in. And so for the out of bounds protests, I want to see the same thing. I want to see players of all racial backgrounds committed to the idea of ensuring that the political rights and political agency of minority groups, not just Black folks, but of minority groups broadly, gets protected. Because the thing that we learn about how this works, they come for Black people first, but they don't just come for Black people. So if you think this issue doesn't affect you, give it time, because it will, unless we put a stop to it. So again, I'm excited about the out of bounds protests by the NAACP, but those are the things that I need to see. Care for the fact that we are putting children in harm's way. And then 2, we need more of a discussion and more of a push for this truly to be a diverse and multiracial effort. The last thing that I'm thinking about is what's going on in Knox County, Tennessee. Speaking of Tennessee. So not too long ago, the Knox County public school system decided to ban the book Roots from the public school libraries. Roots, which is written by Alex Haley, who is one of the greatest Tennesseans ever. Alex Haley, born and raised in Henning, Tennessee, over in East Tennessee. And his book has been banned from, Knox County public schools. So the irony of this, of course. But I want to bring up this topic, not because of the ban, but what happened most recently, which is the superintendent ended up walking it back and reversing the decision and decided to reinsert the book Roots back into the school libraries. Why? Because when they first announced the decision to ban the book, folks showed up and they showed out. They showed up and they showed out. And there was backlash, there were protests, there were folks showing up at the school board meetings, there were petitions circulating, there was real mobilization around this symbol of racial injustice. And so the superintendent, one, tried to make the argument that, well, they had to be in compliance with the state law. There was a state law, it was like the Child Appropriate Act or something that was passed by the Tennessee state legislature, saying that, any books that exposed children to nudity and anything explicit or obscene can be removed, or should be removed. Not even can be, but should be removed. And they made the argument that there was one small passage within Roots that fit this criteria, so they used that to remove it. But then when that activism cranked up, then the superintendent supposedly went back to the legal advisors to try to get clarity on whether the book fit the criteria of the state law, and found that, well, there were different competing legal opinions, and therefore there's not enough to justify keeping the book off the shelves as a way to comply with this state law. This book no longer fits the criteria outlined for banning books under the guise of this state law. So I want to share this story, and I want us to talk about this more because it underscores the most important point, really, of this story and all the stories that I've talked about today, which is that activism matters. Boots on the ground, that's the best way to resist everything that's happening right now between the anti-DEI policies and now racial gerrymandering, book bans. We are seeing an attack on Black people and Black culture that reaches the heights we haven't seen since the Civil Rights Movement. It is real out here. And look, it's the summertime. I know we're trying to be outside, but I think if there's anything that we're learning from these episodes that nobody's talking about, it's that when we mobilize, right? When we're outside to fight back against these attacks on our history, on our culture, on our presence, on our political power, when we fight, we win. When we fight, we win. So the next time you see a story in the news telling you that Black people are just taking loss after loss after loss, I beg you, reject the notion that losing is inevitable. Go and find your boots, get them on the ground, and get ready to fight, because when we fight, we win. When we fight, we win. And that concludes this episode of Jonathan Thinks. Again, I am your host, Jonathan Collins, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar. Remember that every time we convene, it's an opportunity to grow. We do it with love. We do it with joy. We do it together. These were a few of my thoughts. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, you were thinking about it too. In fact, let me know what you're thinking. Hit the comments, hit me on socials. Let me know what you think. right? Let me know what you think about the possibility of, hey, maybe us being outside, fighting back against the redrawing of district lines, against the banning of books, against DEI policies that are limiting opportunities. Let me know how optimistic you feel about what can happen when we fight back. Until next time, peace.